Are you familiar with the case of Paulette Harlow? She's a 75-year-old elderly woman from Massachusetts with a debilitating medical condition. She was prosecuted for violating the FISA Act and sentenced to 2 years in prison. She has to go to Texas in 2 weeks. She was praying at an abortion clinic in Washington, D.C. The FBI interrogated and investigated her. Do you think it is appropriate for a 75-year-old woman who is praying at a clinic in D.C. to be put in prison for 2 years for that activity? Just a simple question. Do you think that's appropriate?
I'm not familiar with the specific case.
You're not familiar with that case. It's been significantly in the headlines, but you don't know how to comment on that case, that it's appropriate for a 75-year-old woman to be put in prison for 2 years for praying at a clinic.
Again, since I'm not familiar with the case, I don't want to start weighing in because I don't know all the facts. But what I can tell you is that when it comes to FACE Act enforcement and abortion-related violent extremism, I think one of the things that gets lost, and I appreciate the opportunity to clarify it, is that really since the Dobbs decision, actually more of our abortion-related violent extremism investigations have focused on violence against pro-life facilities as opposed to the other way around. And we've had a number of investigations. We're using FACE Act resources and our JTTFs.
We're still waiting on responses on letters that we've sent indicating the data to the contrary, that there's been significant amount of efforts in targeting of people who are pro-lifers who go to clinics and that they've been prosecuted, like this case, a 75-year-old woman who is now going to jail in Texas for 2 years because she was praying at a clinic in Washington, D.C. And we've submitted questions on that, and I'd appreciate a response on it. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady from Pennsylvania.
And now I want to talk about another possible assassination attempt. And I'll start by showing a video of President Biden. And this is from recently. This is in the last month, if we can play that.
Gallows erected to hang the Vice President, Mike Pence. I think it's fair to say it's one of the darkest days in the history of America.
Okay, and he's referring to January 6th. Were there gallows erected to hang Mike Pence, as the president says here?
I'm not aware of any physical gallows. I can't remember whether from a demonstration perspective there may not have been some kind of replica or symbol of something like that.
That's my impression. Can we show, can you raise that up so you can see it? It looks like there was some kind of prop that was built. The construction doesn't look like it lends itself to actually hanging somebody. It's more of a prop, I think, as you suggested, that was erected on January 6th. But if the president were correct, that these gallows were erected to hang Mike Pence, that would be a very serious allegation, wouldn't it?
I would take it very seriously, yes.
Has anybody been arrested, or do you have any leads in conjunction with the erection of this gallows? We had a picture here on the screen, if you can show it again. It was just up there. There's an individual here who's seen near these gallows. Has he been arrested? Have you identified this person?
You know, I don't know that I could speak to this specific person or the gallows that are pictured on the image. You know, we have had, I think, 850 people who have pled guilty to federal crimes related to January 6th, and I think, you know, another 180, I think it is, convicted at trials. So I can't be sure.
And some of them merely for going into the Capitol, but here the president suggests that individual intended to hang Vice President Pence, which seems like kind of a wild claim myself, given the construction of those gallows. But if we are to take him seriously, or even if we aren't, let me just finish by saying this. If you have no leads, or you're not sure if anybody who erected those gallows was arrested or is being investigated, you know, were there any confidential human sources involved from the FBI or any other agency in the erection of that prop, those gallows?
I'm not aware of anything like that.
All right, thank you. I yield back.
Gentlemen, Director, that's an important question, though, because you've talked to the counter sniper, and that, I mentioned this in our opening statement, that critical 5 minutes from 6:09 to 6:14, and what takes place there is critical, and I think that's what the gentleman was getting at, and we were hopeful that you could tell us something about your interview with the counter sniper.
Yeah, I guess I want to distinguish a couple things. There is, some individual, not law enforcement, I believe, who spotted the shooter on the roof a few minutes before. But I think law enforcement spotting him with the weapon on the roof is seconds before the
Okay,
shot.
so that's important.
Yeah,
'cause
so there's two different things
I think
going
what you're
on
saying
there.
is it wasn't maybe that if the bad guy shoots at 6:11, then you're saying this encounter with local law enforcement that Mr. Bentz was just getting into happened just seconds before that and maybe not 2 minutes before that?
That's my understanding. That, in other words, that there's different things here. There's an individual, at least one individual I can think of, not law enforcement, member of the public, who observed him on the roof. Not clear whether or not the individual saw a weapon or not, but saw him in a way that was concerning. That is some number of, not many, but like just a handful of minutes. I think separate from that, as far as law enforcement goes, in terms of a weapon, this local officer that we just talked about observed the individual, again, literally just seconds before the shooter took his shots. Separate and apart from all of that, roughly, I think, maybe a little less than or around an hour before the shooting, there were local law enforcement officers who observed the shooter, not up on the roof, not with a weapon, but with I believe, a rangefinder, kind of like you would use if you were playing golf or something, in a way that was odd and suspicious. So that started happening with local law enforcement beforehand. But in terms of shooter, meaning with the weapon, law enforcement, my understanding is that the first time that happened was this local officer climbing up on the roof seconds before the
Again,
shooting.
we want that timeline. I think the committee wants that timeline and communications that were taking place in that short period of time.
Again, as I've said with everything else, I really want to be careful. I'm leaning in, trying to share as much as I can here. Facts are evolving, things may change, but we are working on a timeline, among other things.
Committee will stand in recess until after the Prime Minister's remarks conclude.
Thank you, Director. I've just got two easy questions for you. In February, Donald Trump Jr. received a letter containing a white suspicious powder that read, quote, "Lee Harvey Oswald's grandson must complete his contract," end quote. The United States Secret Service and the FBI said they would investigate the matter, and 5 months later, no more information has been released. I've also visited with Mr. Trump, and he has not received any information either. Why is that?
So as I sit here right now, I'm not familiar with the specific investigation, but I do know that we have had, unfortunately, quite a few investigations of threatening mailings and white powder letters and things like that. So I'm happy to drill into it and have us circle back to you and see if there's more information we can share about it.
Thank you. And would you maybe circle back to the Mr. Trump, Donald Jr.? I think they'd like an update as well.
Sure, let me, again, I don't, like I said,
Okay.
I'm not familiar with the specifics, but I'm happy to have us look into it and get back to whoever we need to get back to.
Thank you. Next question. The Pittsburgh field office now handling the assassination attempt investigation. Is that right?
Well, there's several, there at Pittsburgh field office is the lead office. We obviously have lots of, I think it's about half, maybe over half of the FBI's field offices are working on this, including almost every headquarters division. So we have lots and lots and lots, several hundreds of employees working on it.
All right.
But yes.
Pittsburgh's the lead. Okay. This is the same office that botched the Hunter Biden laptop case. And they, in my view, and my constituents and many Americans, displayed a clear reluctance, that's a quote, reluctance to really do any tasking, quote, effectively failing to investigate, according to the U.S. attorney on the case. My question is, how can we trust this office, and why does it keep reappearing in critical election-related investigations, or is that just dumb luck?
So I want to be a little bit careful on what I can say here, because some of what you're talking about relates to an ongoing investigation being led by the special counsel, Mr. Weiss. But what I can tell you is that the Pittsburgh field office's involvement in the matter you're talking about was the choice by the Attorney General Barr to have the U.S. Attorney and the FBI field office in Pittsburgh handle that particular matter. As to your summary or characterization of what U.S. Attorney, now former U.S. Attorney Brady actually said, I'd have to see the whole context. I'm not quite sure that's what he said, but I think as to your overall question about confidence, what I would tell you is we have, that's the point I'm trying to make about the sheer breadth of our investigation. Yes, the Pittsburgh field office is the office on the ground. That's where the attempted assassination happened. But we are using the full might of the FBI, criminal and national security. That's why I'm pointing out that multiple field offices, over half of our field offices, almost every headquarters division, several hundreds of employees. These are people who are working around the clock to deal with this historic attack. And I have the utmost confidence in those hundreds of employees, agents, analysts, and professional staff, and the American people should too.
I yield to Mr. Jordan.
I appreciate the gentleman yielding.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Director, for being here today. I know it's been a very long day, busy day on Capitol Hill, and also I want to apologize in advance if there's any repetitive questions from me. But I have to ask, given that our sitting president resigned from the campaign on Sunday and the Secret Service Director resigned yesterday, you don't plan on resigning anytime soon, do you, sir?
No, sir.
Good to go. Earlier today, you told this committee that you recovered 8 bullet cartridges from the roof next to the shooter. And given that testimony, I have 2 questions for you. How many shots were fired at President Trump, and how many shots were fired in total of the entire day? I know I keep hearing 8, but were there any more that were unaccounted for?
The best information I have right now is 8 shots. As to the sequence, I'm not sure I have that sitting here right now. As I said to the chairman, I'm going to go back to my team and see if we've got that nailed down yet, and if we have, I'm happy to share it with you and the rest of the committee.
Please do, sir. Thank you very much for that. You also mentioned that the shooter used encrypted messages to communicate. Specifically, do you know what apps or what apps he was using to communicate, and can you confirm if he was communicating with any foreign nationals through the encrypted messages?
So as to the names of the apps, I don't have that right here in front of me. As far as communicating with any foreign actors, I'll say 2 things. One, we haven't, as I think I've testified before, but we have not, at the moment at least, identified any accomplices or co-conspirators, foreign or domestic. Okay. So that, as to foreign contacts, of course, that's part of why we want to get access to the encrypted messages, because that might tell us whether he'd been in contact with somebody.
Thank you. Let's talk about motive. I know the FBI has taken a lead role in investigating the assassination on President Trump. Your team has searched the shooter's phone, conducted countless interviews, done extensive research into his motives. As of today, July 24th, 2024, do you and your team know the motive of the shooter or have any idea on what could have driven it?
Well, know and have any idea are two very different things.
Okay.
We do not know the motive. That is obviously one of the central questions in our investigation. And it's been very frustrating to us that a lot of the usual kind of low-hanging fruit places that we would find at have not yielded significant clues about his motive. Okay. Having said that, we have seen indications that he was interested in public figures. Mm-hmm. And that in the period around July 6th, leading up to July 13th, he does seem to have become very focused on this particular rally and former President Trump. But exactly what his thought process was in doing that, that's something that's still very much under investigation.
I want to make something clear to the American people to try to help out what motive could be. And again, it's not my job to steer it, but here are some of my thoughts. I'm not sure about motive either, specifically, but I can tell you that after this assassination attempt, people on both sides have said that both parties need to tone down the rhetoric. But recently, just on Monday, in fact, President Biden called into the Harris campaign event and said that President Trump was a threat to democracy. Just take a look behind me at these photos. This is a magazine cover of the New Republic from June 2024, published just 1 month before the assassination attempt on President Trump. In a tweet explaining the cover, the New Republic said this: "Today, we at the New Republic think we can spend this election year in one of 2 ways. We could spend it debating whether Trump meets the 9 or 17 points that define fascism, or we could spend it saying he's damn close enough and we'd better fight. We unreservedly choose the latter course." Now, sir, I know you said that the FBI doesn't have a clear motive yet, and you've explained that, but in your professional experience as an investigator, do you think that language like this could radicalize someone to engage in political violence?
I certainly understand the point of the question. What I would tell you is that, respectfully, I don't think it's appropriate for me as FBI director to be characterizing or engaging in public commentary on specific people's rhetoric. And that's because it's not that I don't understand why you're raising the question, but I'm saying that in my role, I have to be very careful to make sure we speak through our work and we speak through our cases and our intelligence products, not the FBI director chiming in the public square on different people's political commentary.
I understand. For the record, there was an assassination attempt on an American president, and I will be asking these same questions even if it were President Biden. And my message to the American people is that we need to do better. I give back the rest of my time, and thank you for being here, sir. I know it's been a very long day.
Mr. Morelli.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, always for your leadership, and thanks to the ranking member. Director, I want to say that I do trust you, and I'm very, very grateful for your service on behalf of this entire country and the people who put their faith in you and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And I frankly find it somewhat astonishing at this date and the age in which we live that the American leadership here at times questions the role of the FBI. I don't question it. I know you have a tough job, and I appreciate all the incredible work that you do. If I may, I just wanted to, despite decreasing, I think you mentioned in your testimony, decreasing rates of homicide and non-fatal shootings in my community of Rochester, New York, upstate New York, we remain in a gun violence state of emergency. As you know, the passage of the 2022 Bipartisan Safer Communities Act implemented changes in the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, NICS, including a comprehensive background check on gun buyers under the age of 21 years old. In this fiscal year, you're requesting $43 million to sustain implementation of that act, as well as $8.4 million to support enhanced background checks, which includes funding to address provisions such as the under 21 background checks. And I'm just would ask, considering the critical role NICS plays in preventing firearms from reaching the wrong hands, can you just share with me how the budget request will allow the FBI to address these, what I expect are, and assume are pretty labor-intensive enhancements to the operation of NICS as transactions continue to grow?
So I appreciate the question. The Bipartisan Safer Communities Act added a number of additional checks that NICS was responsible for conducting, specifically focused on, as we would call it, the U21 group population. And this committee, and we're very grateful for that, helped get us, at the time of the passage of the act, funding to bring on board positions and make certain systems changes. But the problem is it was one-time funding. And so that if we're going to sustain the work, then we need funding to continue it. And that's what you see reflected in the request here. It's both to continue those positions, because it's, as you say, very labor intensive, but also for systems enhancements to have the human workforce have them be even more efficient in their work. I've been out there myself and sat with the operators who were doing the checks on a couple of occasions to see, and so I can see kind of how labor intensive it is. I'm very pleased with the fact that they're already getting much, much faster at them. And I think that's only going to improve, but we still do need the funding. Again, the way to remember it is just funding was there, but it was one-time funding, and we just need the funding to sustain it. Otherwise, it sort of loses its effectiveness.
And that's going to be obviously an annual request then to be able to continue to maintain this, and I suspect
Yes,
may even require additional dollars in future years to be able to deal with the growing number of challenges that we have there. If I can, coordination and partnership between the FBI and state, local, and tribal entities is integral to the security of communities across the nation. In my community, the FBI leads the Rochester Area Major Crimes Task Force, the Child Exploitation Task Force, and the Joint Terrorism Task Force, and participates in the Rochester Safe Streets Task Force. Considering your successful nationwide efforts alongside state and local law enforcement partners to combat violent crime, could you describe how the proposed budget will further enhance and strengthen information sharing and coordination among not only the FBI, but all your local partners?
So the biggest part of our budget request in '25 is to restore and essentially the cuts that we endured in the '24 budget, which there's no way to sustain without having an impact on our efforts on violent crime, on child exploitation, on a whole range of threats that we're responsible for protecting the American people from. And so the request will allow us to continue the good work that's being done in upstate New York and elsewhere on gang violence, on child exploitation, on cyber attacks, on the cartels and organized crime, which, as I said before, that's not just a border problem. It affects all 50 states, and we're seizing huge amounts of fentanyl all over the country. So all these things are incredibly important. Our folks are doing great work. On the violent crime side, for example, just last year, we were arresting through our task forces 50 violent criminals and child predators per day, every day, all year long. So a cut means more bad guys on the street, more gangs terrorizing neighborhoods, more kids at risk, et cetera.
I see my time has expired. Mr. Chair, you're always very gracious. I appreciate it. Director, thank you for your continued service, sir. I yield back.
Mr. Clyde?
Chair will recognize himself for an opening statement. July 13th was a terrible day for America. We all agree spirited debate, fighting for what you believe in, are part of what makes this country the greatest nation in the world. But the First Amendment and robust political debate are not consistent in any way with violence. What happened in Butler, Pennsylvania was a tragedy that took the life of a good man, Corey Compratore, leaving a wife without a husband and 2 daughters without a father. Others were injured, and of course, former President Trump, by the grace of God, survived the assassination attempt. There are a lot of unanswered questions about the security failures that day, questions about decisions made before the rally, questions about actions during the rally, and questions about statements made after the event concluded. Prior to the rally, why was the president's security detail denied requests for extra resources? Why weren't all the buildings secured? There were a finite number of buildings that needed to be secured. Why wasn't that done? Why was the president allowed to walk out on the stage when there was a suspicious person on the property? During the rally, what exactly happened between 6:09 and 6:14, those critical 5 minutes? We know from briefings from the director and the deputy director at the FBI and other information we've gathered that at 6:09, the shooter was identified on the roof. At 6:10, the counter sniper was notified. Counter sniper teams were notified about the shooter. 6:11, the shooter fired several shots, injuring and killing one person, injuring others. At 6:12, the counter sniper took down the shooter, and at 6:14, President Trump was escorted off the stage by Secret Service agents. We need to know what happened play by play, moment by moment, second by second, the communications that took place, again, during that critical 5 minutes. And then finally, after the rally, why did both the Secret Service and Secretary of Homeland Security Mayorkas lie to the American people? July 14th, the day after the attack, Secret Service spokesman Anthony Guglielmi said this, quote, "The assertion that a member of the former president's security team requested additional security resources that the U.S. Secret Service or the Department of Homeland Security rebuffed is absolutely false." The next day, Secretary Mayorkas said, "That is an unequivocally false assertion. We had not received any requests for additional security measures that were rebuffed." But 5 days later, top officials repeatedly rejected requests from Donald Trump's security detail for more personnel. And on the 21st of July, the New York Times, confirming what the Washington Post reported, said, quote, "Mr. Guglielmi acknowledged that the Secret Service had turned down requests for additional federal security assets for Mr. Trump's detail." 180-degree change. Why did they initially lie to us in the days after the attack in Pennsylvania? Finally, we hope to learn more today from Director Wray about the shooter, his use of the drone, the explosives that were in his car, how he got on the roof, and a host of other questions. It is our hope that Director Wray's testimony can begin to give answers to the American people about all of these questions and concerns. So, Director, we appreciate you being here, and we trust that you're going to be as transparent with the committee and the country as you possibly can. And I'm sure you understand that a significant portion of the country has a healthy skepticism regarding the FBI's ability to conduct a fair, honest, open, and transparent investigation. And that skepticism is based on what they've witnessed over the past several years. The American people have seen a Biden-Harris Justice Department that can't tell us who planted the pipe bombs on January 6th, that can't tell us who leaked the Dobbs opinion, and that can't tell us who put cocaine at the White House. A Biden-Harris Justice Department who raided President Trump's home, Biden-Harris Justice Department who worked with social media companies to censor Americans, Biden-Harris Justice Department who let the country believe that the Hunter Biden laptop was misinformation when they knew at the time it was authentic, and maybe most importantly, a Biden-Harris Justice Department who retaliated against whistleblowers who came to this committee and spoke to us about these issues. Last week, we sent you 12 questions about what occurred on July 13th. We expect you to answer those questions and the others that I've just outlined. And again, we thank you for being here today and appreciate your willingness to answer the questions that the committee is going to have. And with that, I would yield to the ranking member for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I begin, and this is not directly with you, actually, I just wanted to straighten something out. I know my colleagues, the gentlemen and the gentleladies from Georgia, Washington, California, Pennsylvania, they all mentioned Project 2025. Well, I don't know how they expect you to know about that, number one. I'm pretty damn involved. I don't really know a whole lot about it. But President Trump has made it clear, and we're going to say it again, we'll say it over and over again, that there are some things he disagreed with, some things he agreed with that he wasn't that familiar with. It was from the Heritage Foundation. And that was just raw politics, to be honest with you. It was just because 2025 has some things in it that they believe are really going to offend American people, and it very well may. And so they want to pin it on the presidential candidate. He didn't author it, he didn't condone it, he didn't put his seal of approval on it. It's getting old. It really is. We do this with other things. Just like in this committee, when anything goes wrong, anything, somehow Donald Trump's name has to be brought into it, and it gets tiring. It's politics over reality. Second thing about picking the site, I was intimately involved in the Wildwood rally, the biggest rally President Trump's ever had, biggest political rally in the state of New Jersey. I had spoken to the president about it, and he wanted to do it on the beach because we had over 100,000 people. And let me tell you, we had everybody out there because they were concerned, the Secret Service and the local police and the county police and just about every entity could be. And so they had, behind it was that iconic setting. They had the Ferris wheels on the pier and all the stuff. They had agents up in there. They had agents in the ocean, in the water, in boats. They had people coordinating, working with each other and talking with each other because they knew it was a risk. So we chose a site that was difficult. The president did, and I thought it was a great site, but nevertheless, the law enforcement responded properly. Something went wrong here. You can't blame this on Donald Trump as well. The site was chosen. It's the responsibility of those who serve in law enforcement to make sure that he was safe, period. And I'm sure you'll find out why. On another tangent here, you know, I've got to wonder how many qualified people were passed in order for Director Cheadle to get her 30% quota. That's a lousy way to run an agency, especially when it's dealing with law enforcement, to say we've got to have 30% of anything. And I worry about these practices because it's policy over protection. And Director Wray, I know that some things were left to you. I understand that. But one of your early acts on the Biden presidency was hiring the FBI's very first chief diversity officer. And since that time, and even before your time, and you're going to disagree with me, but respectfully, I'm going to disagree with you. Recruitment standards under your lead has resulted in deterioration in many areas, including physical fitness, illicit drug use, financial irregularities, mental health issues, full-time work experience, and integrity. And I know you dismissed them, but in October 2023, they are a prestigious group of retired FBI special agents and analysts both expressed concern regarding the FBI's willingness to recruit agents that, quote, I'm not saying this, they said it, not me, can't even pass the new relaxed standards for fitness, who are illiterate in some cases and need lessons, educational lessons, don't want to work weekends or after hours, their words, and have serious disabilities or mental health issues, which is not the place for them. Most of your agents are great people. I love them. I love them for what they do. I'm not criticizing most. But these new standards, don't you think this is a hindrance and reduces the morale of the vast majority of good people that you have in the FBI? And I ask you for a quick answer because I have a few other things.
So I respect our retired agents, that many of them come to our graduations now, and I can tell you emphatically that they are those who think that we have lowered our standards, whether it's on physical fitness or anything else, are mistaken.
And you can prove that.
The facts back me up on that.
The standards are the same today as they were a decade ago.
I'll give
I
you-
mean, they've changed in some ways that are appropriate.
In fact, the physical fitness standards, depends on how far back you go, but the physical fitness standards that our current graduates have to graduate from Quantico actually exceed some of the physical fitness standards that were in place if you go back far enough with some of our retirees. But what I would tell you, I think part of the reason there's confusion, and again, I accept that these folks are raising their concerns in good faith, but we have actually access to the facts. And part of the reason I think there's confusion, just take the physical fitness thing as an example, is that before you had to pass the physical fitness test before you showed up to Quantico. Now you have to pass it in order to get a badge at Quantico. The standard hasn't changed. You still have to pass the same test, the same 12-point standard, et cetera. All that stuff applies. The only difference is you can pass it while you're at Quantico. But if you don't pass that same test that's been in place for a long time now, you don't get a badge. And we will dismiss people from Quantico, and we do, who don't pass that
Director, I know I
test.
have to wrap this up, and I appreciate that. If you could get us information that substantiates what you say, that should be easy enough to do to the whole committee, I'd appreciate it. You know, feelings in this administration are more important than functionality. It's resulted in a border crisis. We don't have time to talk about that. You've spoken out about it. I appreciate that you've spoken out about it. I think it's also resulted in shortages in our nation's law enforcement and our military, and I think it makes us less safe. So I look forward to seeing those statistics and that proof, because I have people talking to my ear that tell me otherwise, and I yield back.
Nice.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Wray, I'm going to go a little bit different route with my questioning. In testimony before the Senate Judiciary Committee in December of last year, you stated that the FBI is, quote, especially concerned about the possibility of Hamas supporters engaging in violence on the group's behalf, end quote, and that the threat from a, quote, terrorist organization who may exploit the attacks at Israel as a tool to mobilize their followers around the world, end quote. We've seen a lot of conduct today that I think is concerning to many people in terms of Hamas terrorists and their sympathizers. Reports have surfaced alleging that many of the groups intimidating and violating the civil rights of Jewish American students, like the Students for Justice for Palestine, received guidance and financial support from American Muslims for Palestine, and that AMP's directors allegedly have links to groups which fundraise for Hamas. Director Wray, is the Bureau aware of or investigating whether these groups violating the civil liberties of Jewish Americans are connected to or affiliated with Hamas or other terrorist organizations?
So we are investigating a lot of attacks and threats against the Jewish community. I've been very vocal on how big a concern that is, and certainly that was already heightened even before October 7th, and since October 7th, it went to a whole nother level. We are actively engaged with Jewish community, both locally and nationally. When it comes to foreign terrorist organizations and their role, or foreign adversaries and their role, we are looking hard to see if we can find linkage, you know, for example, you know, funding or things like that. Nothing that I can report at this time, but it's something.
But you're investigating it.
It is the kind of thing that we're looking for, absolutely, because we know that there's an interest in their part to foment.
We're watching it in
yes.
real time today.
Right, yes.
There are other reports that Mayor Bitar, National Security Council Coordinator for Intelligence and Defense Policy and Deputy Assistant to the President, was an active member in Students for Justice in Palestine at Georgetown University, which is one of the groups alleged to have ties to Hamas. Is the Bureau investigating whether the Biden-Harris administration is compromised by pro-Hamas groups and organizations?
Well, again, we're having quite a number of Hamas-related investigations.
I'm
I
asking
can't-
specifically
yeah, I can't-
about whether you are investigating whether the Biden-Harris administration has been compromised by pro-Hamas groups.
There's nothing along those lines that I can think of to report.
I also want to talk to you a bit about the FBI's investigation and involvement with the Russia collusion hoax. And the FBI was involved with that because of its potential relationship to election interference. Is that correct? The FBI's involvement in investigating the Russia collusion hoax. That was because there was concern about election interference. Is that correct?
Well, the FBI was involved and staffed as investigators the Special Counsel Mueller investigation into efforts by the Russian government to influence and interfere.
With the election, correct?
Yes.
All right. So is the FBI investigating what just happened with Joe Biden being forced out of the race after winning the Democrat primary as election interference? Is the FBI investigating that right now?
I'm
What's happened just in
not
the last
aware
couple
of any
weeks?
investigation along those lines.
Okay. Director Wray, it was reported in March that the FBI's Foreign Influence Task Force resumed communication with social media companies. And an FBI spokesman has stated that, quote, in coordination with the Department of Justice, the FBI recently implemented procedures to facilitate sharing information about foreign malign influence with social media companies in a way that reinforces that private companies are free to decide on their own whether and how to take action on the information, end quote. Director Wray, what specifically is the FBI doing to reinforce that such decisions are, in fact, for the private companies to make and not the administration?
So I think the best way to summarize it is that the guidance makes all kinds of additional steps to underscore that the FBI has no interest in participating in any way whatsoever in the company's decision-making, that companies are completely free to take any actions on their own, that we are simply passing information on to them for them to do whatever it is they want to do independently, consistent with, I should say, I very much appreciate the Supreme Court's finding that no evidence that the FBI coerced platforms to take content down.
Well, I don't believe that that's what the Supreme Court found. What the Supreme Court found was that the parties involved didn't have standing, but I think there's a whole body of evidence and legal analysis demonstrating that, in fact, this administration was violating the First Amendment rights of folks through social media companies. I'm just going to ask one final very quick question. If the FBI was involved in the removal or restriction of speech of Americans, do you agree that this would be a violation of the First Amendment?
Well, again, I'm not going to engage in hypotheticals. My understanding and my strong view from everything I've seen is that we did not violate the First Amendment.
Okay.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Texas. Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Was the shooter on the FBI's radar in any way prior to the assassination attempt?
We did not have any information about the shooter. He was not in our holdings before the shooting.
No communication in any chat rooms, no CIs or confidential human sources have any interaction with
No, we've run a thorough search for the subject through all of our holdings, and he was not in them anywhere.
Were there any FBI agents or informants present at the Trump rally in Butler?
Not to my knowledge.
And Mr. Jordan was talking to you about Iran. Were law enforcement resources diverted from the protection of President Trump to John Bolton as a consequence of concern that Mr. Bolton might have been the target of Iranian malign efforts?
That's really a Secret Service decision. I don't know the answer to that. That's really something they would know better. What I can tell you is that there are a number of individuals, you mentioned one who we've brought a case a specific criminal case for the Iranians targeting for assassination, but how the
Are you
Secret
gonna
Service
get that answer
allocates-
to us, whether or not resources were diverted from Trump to Bolton? Is that just gonna be part of your review?
I think that's going to be part of the reviews by the Inspector General.
The Inspector
and the
General for
after-
DHS, right?
Of DHS
Right,
and
and
the outside
Got it.
panel.
And I think that's
after
an important point because the Inspector General for DHS has really fallen out of favor with the administration because he's been pointing out all the problems on the border with Mayorkas and Biden, and we're always kind of worried that they're about to fire him, which would be a really bad idea now that this role that you've identified is so critical. Be a bad idea to fire the IG for DHS during the pendency of this, right, Mr. Director?
I don't think that would be a good idea.
I'm with you on that. So I want to zoom out a little bit. How often do you brief President Biden?
You mean on this
No, just
specific
generally.
case?
No, in your role as FBI director.
I mean, I don't know that I could give you a number.
Is it like weekly, monthly, daily?
It's not at a regular cadence. There have been times when there have been months at a time when I haven't, and then there have been times when several days apart I have. It's always with other people.
The vice president, is she typically there?
Often has been.
Okay, so when did you notice his decline?
In my interactions, in my role, all my interactions with the current president have been completely professional.
Right, but I mean the cognitive decline. I'm not saying he treated you unprofessionally, just maybe not picking things up as quickly as he used to.
Again, I don't meet with him very often, but what you're describing is not something that I've observed during my interactions with him.
I mean, we've had it observed so often that the ranking member and Mr. Schiff on this committee have said that he could no longer continue as a candidate. And so, since you're the FBI director, I was just sort of wondering, like, who's running the country? Like if something bad happened, you'd have to go brief President Biden about it right now? God forbid?
And on any number of occasions, I have briefed the president, and as I said, those briefings have all been uneventful and unremarkable.
Oh, I can imagine them being uneventful. But in the work where the vice president's also present, like you say, there's like more than half the time there's these briefings, she's there too?
I don't know if I'd said more than half the time. Certainly, there have been times where she's been present. There have been other times where she hasn't.
I take you at your word when you say this is the most complicated threat environment you've ever observed over a long career in law enforcement. And I'm just kind of wondering, with this assassination attempt, with the invasion at our border, with all the Hamas that have been let in that you've talked about and briefed about, like, is Biden up to it? And if he's not up to it, and you're a guy who's been regularly briefing him, like, who's been in on this conspiracy to hide the real Joe Biden from all of us for years? It never occurred to you that this guy wasn't up to it in all these briefings you did?
As I said, my briefings with the president have all been completely fine.
Were they
I
between
briefed,
10 a.m. and
he's
4
asked
p.m.?
questions. There hasn't been anything of note in the area that you're talking about.
Yeah, did you ever have to brief him before 10 a.m. or after 4 p.m.? We hear those are as good hours.
I certainly, times that I have briefed have included outside those hours.
Right, okay. I just, I think the American people want to know how we got to this point with someone who's so diminished, his own party has basically put him out to pasture. And since you had close proximity and the vice president had close proximity, I'm just kind of wondering if you were being straight with all of us about how things were going with him. I guess we'll have to figure that out.
You can count on me to be straight with you, sir.
We'll see.
Gentlemen, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Director Wray, to the best of your understanding, how close did the assassin's bullet come to killing President Trump?
My understanding is that either it or some shrapnel is what grazed his ear. So I don't know that I have the actual
very
distance.
close, though.
What's that?
Very, very close, you would agree.
Yes.
Is this the biggest security failure that you've seen in your career?
Well, certainly, I think former Director Cheadle has already, I think, acknowledged that this was a significant, at the very least, a significant operational failure. I forgot her exact words, but I will defer on that. I think
But we really
it speaks
haven't
for
seen
itself.
anything like this in at least decades in this country, right?
The attempted assassination of a president, current or former, is a historic event.
Was this a sophisticated plot that Thomas Crooks carried out?
Well, I think probably depends on your definition of sophisticated, right? So on the one hand, he's a 20-year-old, seems to, from what we've seen so far, loner, you know, without a, you know, a lot of elaborate criminal history, without any criminal history or anything like that. On the other hand, he did clearly do some level of planning and recon.
When did the planning start, to the best of your knowledge?
What's that?
When did the planning start?
Well, we're still drilling into that, but we know, we assess that, on July 6th,
So a week in advance.
for example, it seems to be that he seems to become very focused on it, because that's when, as I've testified here today, that's when the laptop that we've tied to him has the Google search, how far away was Oswald from Kennedy?
I mean, that seems like an indication of a total amateur, right? Someone who's searching for that, and he's doing it a week in advance.
Again, I don't want to characterize him, I frankly don't want to give him the credit of characterizing him as amateur or professional, but what I will say is that there are some things he did that involve a certain amount of planning and preparation. On the other hand, if you're telling me, do I think this is the most sophisticated ever? Of course not. We deal with much more sophisticated adversaries all the time.
And you probably prepare for more sophisticated plans to target high-level officials.
I'm sorry, I couldn't
You
hear you.
probably prepare for more sophisticated plans to target high-level officials, correct?
We don't do physical security, but yes, obviously we're investigating much more sophisticated attacks all the time.
How about the encrypted applications on his phone? Were those there for a while, or did he download them, you know, in the days or weeks leading up to the assassination attempt?
I don't have the answer to that sitting here right now. I think it may vary from platform to platform because he had a number of encrypted messaging apps on it. And again, as I've said, we're trying to get access to that content. And that's important. I think it's important for everybody on this committee to understand that this is a real problem for law enforcement. That these companies, let's be clear here, these companies are designing their platforms in a way to, no matter how heinous the crime, no matter how rock solid the legal process,
I'm run out of
to
time,
get
so I
access.
want to get the next question. At this moment, are you confident that high-level protectees, presidents, former presidents, are well protected?
Well, it's not really for me to say. I have a lot of respect for the men and women of the Secret Service who provide protection, just as I do for their counterparts at other agencies.
You can't say one way or the other. Your assessment as director of the FBI whether the president is safe?
I'm not an expert on protective details and physical security. What I would tell you is that we have a very robust system for sharing threat information with those agencies, and that in my experience, the men and women of the Secret Service are professionals who are hardworking, who are literally willing to take a bullet for their protectee.
You mentioned a thwarted assassination attempt against former President Bush. Are there any other thwarted assassination attempts against current or former presidents that you could discuss?
Not that immediately come to mind, but you know, I'd have to go back and think about that. I mean, you know, obviously we've been around for a while, and current and former presidents are high-profile targets who are attractive to all kinds of bad guys.
There's also been reports that the shooter's parents called local law enforcement to say he was missing on the day of the shooting. Is that correct? And if so, is that something that you would see as a sort of a natural thing for them to do? It seems like a 20-year-old who's been missing for a few hours, maybe his parents don't, first thing they do, call the police. What was going on with that situation?
So my recollection, I don't have this in front of me, my recollection is they did call, concerned that he was missing. My recollection, though, is that they didn't call until, this was after I think this was after the event.
I see.
But I'm not certain of that, so I want to, you know, hedge on that slightly because I have to get back to you to confirm that. I believe that part of the issue was that when he last saw his father, he, I think, indicated to his father that he was going to shoot at the range. And then, of course, he didn't go to the range and he didn't come back from that. And so I think that may have added to the level of concern.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady from Wyoming's recognized.
And Director Wray, welcome again to this committee, and I want to thank you and your agents for good job you're doing to protect Americans. Earlier this week, I was part of the group that went out to visit Butler, Pennsylvania Homeland Security members. I agree with my colleagues that have said violence has no part in our democracy. And I trust you will investigate the events surrounding July 13th thoroughly. I'm going to ask you a question. I hope you keep it in mind as your investigation proceeds, which is, who's in charge? Who's in charge at a campaign rally, setting it up? Secret Service or a campaign? And I ask this question because when I was there, had a couple of law enforcement individuals alluding to that question as well. They gave me an example. They said, if a Secret Service says you need to set up a line of dump trucks behind the stage to serve, to protect the candidate, and the campaign says that's bad optics, who ends up winning the debate? So my question is, who's in charge? And as you investigate this crime scene, hope you ask the locally elected officials. I spoke to a county supervisor, local police and sheriff. They all had information they wanted us to know, to relay. We just didn't have the opportunity to sit down and talk to them. There was a lot of concern that they weren't given enough time to prepare for this rally. They thought there were things that could have been done better. And ultimately, what I keep thinking, what I keep coming back to is question, who's in charge at these rallies? I think it's an important one because we have an election right around the corner. Pennsylvania, Butler, these areas, battleground states around the country will continue to be areas where our candidates, both sides, will show up, and the threats will continue to be there. So I hope, Director Wray, that you'll keep that statement in mind as you continue to investigate this crime scene.
Well, I appreciate the question. I will tell you that we've conducted well over 400 interviews, but we have many more still to conduct. And as is not unusual in an investigation, I'm sure there will be situations where we have to go back to people we've already interviewed with follow-up questions. And our interviews cover a wide range of people. I do think it's important to make sure that the committee and the American people understand the scope of our investigation versus the scope of others. Our investigation is focused on the shooter and his attack. There is, of course, and I understand completely why, there are two separate reviews, one by the DHS Inspector General and the other by this outside independent panel that's been announced, that are focused on the security posture, the adequacy of the security posture at the rally, Secret Service decision-making and actions and things like that. And so I certainly understand why there are all those questions, but those are in scope of those two other reviews, and of course, whatever Congress chooses to do. Our investigation, though, because of our interviews of people who are on the scene, will relate to that in some ways, and we're going to share whatever we learn that's relevant with those other reviews.
Director Wray, my last minute that I have, I'm going to flip quickly to your good job resources. Earlier this year in the Appropriations Committee, you testified that you were, for 2024, your budget was $500 million below what you needed to sustain your 2023 efforts. A few minutes ago, you talked about foreign terrorists. The last few weeks, I know information has emerged. That information came from FISA information that was able to be collected overseas on these possible terrorist threats. What we have here today is a domestic terrorist, what looks to be a lone wolf. Your statements, there's nothing really there that would have tipped anybody off to this individual. Is that what I'm hearing from you?
Well, I don't know that I'd go quite that far because we're still investigating a lot related to the shooter. It does appear so far that we're seeing less in his...
My 6 seconds, I would just say, I would ask that you let us know what resources you need to protect the American public and our candidates in our democratic system.
I appreciate the question. I would just say this. We are in, as I've said consistently today and for quite some time now, we are in an elevated threat environment covering a wide range of threats, and the FBI is central to protecting the American people from those threats. And state and local law enforcement, who depend on us every day, rely on us for all sorts of services, databases, forensic support, training. I could go on and on and on. And a lot of those departments, unlike the FBI, have had a hard time recruiting. And so this is not a time to pull back on our funding because we're going to leave our brothers and sisters in state and local law enforcement twisting in the wind, and then by extension, the American people we're all collectively sworn to protect.
Thank you, and Mr. Chair, I yield.
Yield back. Gentleman from North Dakota is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I really appreciate you correcting the gaming thing about this is my coming out party, because we're asking you to do something, and we've had acrimonious, you and I have actually had acrimonious, but we're not here for a got you moment. We're just not on this. And we're asking you to give us information before the investigation is complete. My only recommendation or suggestion would be when that happens, don't necessarily wait till you ask, because don't wait for us to ask. Because and I'll go through why in a second. I appreciate you coming in, I appreciate you telling us things, I appreciate you guys going against essentially your normal policy of waiting till an investigation is done because the American people need to know it, but here's why. There's a guy with a rangefinder walking around that everybody noticed and then couldn't find. You know, he's scaled to the top of a roof within 150 yards line of sight to the presidential, Republican former presidential candidate by climbing a drain pipe, and then you said some equipment. He was being pointed out by rally goers everywhere they could, and nobody could figure it out. There's maybe supposed to be local law enforcement in the building, either upstairs or downstairs, and all of this is going on. And I was talking to a colleague of mine yesterday on the floor, and it's like, I hate the conspiracy theories that come out, but this is not the FBI's purview. This is the Secret Service's purview. This is so comically like inept to the average North Dakota citizen. Is just, they look at this and they're like, how could this possibly happen? And so when by you giving us information in a really meaningful way, even though we know the investigation's ongoing and things can change, that at least helps us to deal with that and figure out where we're at. And so, I mean, and you're doing all this. This guy had no combat training, no counter surveillance training that you're aware of, right?
I'm sorry, I couldn't quite hear
He
that.
had no combat training.
Oh, no, I don't think any, certainly no what we would call, what you and I would call combat training. Obviously, he was a fairly active recreational shooter, so he did plenty of shooting.
A lot of guys in Western
Yeah.
North Dakota, right? I mean, all of those different things. And somehow we came within under of an inch of a presidential candidate being shot and killed within 100 days out from an election. And when you look at it, so I just want to be really clear, because there is a lot of this. There is no evidence of another shooter, right?
I mean, another shooter.
Yeah.
I mean, there's the counter sniper who took out the shooter.
Well,
But right. But you're talking about like another.
Anybody else. And you're looking at his online and seeing all that, but there's no evidence he had any other accomplices on scene that day, correct?
Correct. Not that we've seen yet, certainly.
And you said, and Oversight's had a hearing, DHS had a hearing, we're having a hearing now. The Inspector General's going to investigate. We're probably announcing a bipartisan outside panel. But there's another investigation too, right? Because somebody has to clear the shooter. Like, even though it is a Secret Service officer deploying his, I mean, when an FBI agent kills somebody in the line of duty, what's the process?
So we have what we call an agent-involved shooting, is I think what you're getting at. And we have a whole process.
Usually get put on leave, paid leave, get a lawyer, depending on how it is, right?
Some of those things depend, but we have, our inspection division does a shoot review of each time when there's one of these situations. And they sometimes have to coordinate with local prosecutors who are also doing some kind of review. But But so yes, Secret Service would have a similar kind of process for the counter.
I mean, because you have to actually establish one of the defenses to homicide. Just like, I mean, you don't do it in a court system the same way everybody else does, but you have to justify that that shooting was justified. So when the FBI does that, do they conduct that all internally?
Most of the time, yes. Every once in a while, there's a situation where the Inspector General gets involved.
Do you know how the Secret Service does it?
I don't.
Okay. And I just think that's important because when we're talking about how this works, and I don't think anybody is arguing it wasn't, anybody who's seen it knows what happens, but it's just knowing it and making sure that the process is handled correctly. And I just want to shift gears with my last 30 seconds really quickly because we had a hearing on the northern border in Grand Forks, and you were talking about specific threats from Iran, but also generally. And we've diverted an exceptional amount of resources at the southern border. Our interactions, 114% increase in apprehensions. And the one specific thing, with all due respect to my friends and my neighbors from Canada, it's a lot easier to get into Canada for some of these countries where we have these real issues with terrorist threats than it is to the United States, particularly Iran. And are you guys monitoring that and making sure whatever coordination you have with Canada that we're paying attention to that as well?
We have an excellent relationship, we, the FBI, with our Canadian counterparts, both RCMP, the Mounties, as some people euphemistically call them, and CSIS, my intelligence service counterparts. We have great relationships with them, and terrorism is, I find, probably the #1 thing we talk about.
Yeah, they're understaffed and overworked on the northern border, and they can use all the help you get. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you, Chair Johnson, and thank you so much, Director Wray, for your transparency and your testimony today. First, I want to say my friend, my mentor, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, was known by many as the voice of reason here in Congress, and she was my friend before I even came to Congress. And in my freshman year, she kind of took me under her wing and she kind of showed me the ropes. And she was a force to be reckoned with. And I can say that she will never, ever be replaced. And she was a trailblazer, and I know that she will sorely be missed here in Congress. Director Wray, I only have one question for you today, but before we get to that point, I'd just like to reiterate today that political violence is never acceptable. Regardless of how different our political values and views are, attempted assassinations are a stain to the very democratic ideals of this nation. We have endured riots on Capitol Hill on January 6th, where a literal noose was erected on Capitol grounds, intended for then Vice President Pence and Speaker Emeritus Nancy Pelosi. Political violence against election workers, that has been expressed today. An attack on Paul Pelosi, Nancy Pelosi's husband. Threats against the FBI agents, as you have expressed, and prosecutors, and threats to the staff who serve the public every single day. Congressman Connolly's staff was targeted and attacked last year. And now we have the attempted assassination of a former president of the United States. All of this within just the last 3 years. This violence simply needs to end. The assassination attempt on Donald Trump was, by the grace of God, a failure. The weapon the 20-year-old man was able to obtain, an AR-15, generally has a shooting range up to 600 yards, and shot Mr. Trump from almost 150 yards away. This weapon has the ability to kill multiple people in seconds, and sadly, Corey Compouture lost his life because of this man and because of this gun. Mr. Compouture's family will never be the same. Trust me, I understand that more than anyone else in this room. Is the near loss of a former president enough for this Congress to finally take action? Because there are 206 of us that are already standing in the wings, ready to take immediate action to ban assault weapons today. We need only 12 more of our colleagues to join us in courage and move the legislation to save lives of so many of the people that we are elected to serve by removing assault weapons from the hands of people who simply should not have them in their possession. We are crippling our democracy, and we are ripping apart our fellow Americans until we do. I ask today, because it is clearly it wasn't enough to take action when the lethality of assault weapons, we lost 26 and 7-year-olds and 6 teachers in 2012, when I also lost my son to gun violence, or 14 teenagers and 3 more teachers in 2018, nor was it enough when we lost 19 more children and 2 more teachers in 2022. Well, is it enough now? Now that a former president, the very president that many of you in this room are hoping will be reelected, almost lost his life because this Congress has failed to reinstate an assault weapons ban. A ban that, by the way, Republicans joined with Democrats the past 30 years ago. Well, fine. If y'all don't like assault weapons ban, we can bring another bill that I have introduced to a vote, the Go Safe Act. This bill focuses on the components of the semi-automatic firearms and regulates their infrastructure, sale, and transfer. This, again, is not the time for thoughts and prayers. This is a time for action. Director Wray, just one question I have for you. Would you rather have your officers protected or protect someone against an assault weapon being shot from 147 yards away, or a standard pistol with no accessories attached?
Well, again, I'm going to refrain from appearing to comment on specific legislative proposals, but I can tell you that we have certainly concerned about the danger to law enforcement from any kind of high-powered weapon in the wrong hands. And it hits close to home for us because just not that long ago, 2 great agents, Laura Schwarzenberger and Dan Alphen, down in Miami, executing a search in a crimes against children case, were shot and killed by a subject with an automatic weapon. So again, dangerous weapons in the wrong hands is something that, of course, from a law enforcement perspective concerns us, but I'm not going to wade into the legislative process.
Well, thank you for that answer. I'd rather give our agents a fighting chance, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
Recognizes the gentleman from California.
Thank you. Mr. Director, when we abandoned Afghanistan, we released about 5,000 terrorists from the Parowan detention facility. One of those terrorists showed up at Abbey Gate 10 days later and killed 13 U.S. Marines. Where are the other 5,000?
I don't know that I can tell you where all 5,000
Well,
of
let
them
me
are.
put it more simply. Have you encountered any here in the United States?
We have quite a few ongoing investigations into foreign terrorist-related subjects, whether they're Al-Qaeda related or ISIS related, that we're conducting as you and I are having this conversation, and certainly.
So have you encountered any from Parowan here in the United States?
Specifically, I'm not sure I can say that. Let me follow up and make sure if there's anything more I can provide you on that.
Well, meanwhile, we've had about 1.5 million known gotaways cross the border as this crisis has unfolded. Any estimate of how many of those 5,000 among the 1.5 million known gotaways may be terrorists?
I know that we have seen an uptick, which is obviously concerning to me, and I can tell from your question, concerning to you, in KSTs, as we call them, known or suspected terrorists coming across the southwest border. And our folks are working very hard to try to do our part to try to keep tabs on those individuals.
Speaking of upticks, have we seen an uptick in criminal cartel or cartel-related gang activity in the United States over the last several years?
Yes, the cartels working in kind of an unholy alliance with dangerous violent gangs here in the U.S. are responsible not just for the
abominable distribution of fentanyl all over the country, but also an awful lot of the violence that
And
comes
that's
along with
coming
it.
principally across our southern border?
That's a huge driver of it, certainly.
Huge driver. It's reported we've lost contact with the guardians of more than 85,000 unaccompanied minors who've been brought here by the cartels through the southern border. How many of these children are still unaccounted for?
That I'm not sure we have the answer to that. That may be a question for DHS.
What's the Woods procedure?
The Woods procedure is a procedure has nothing to do with 702. It has to do with traditional FISA, Title I FISA as we call it, and involves having files that have all the underlying documents to support each of the factual assertions
Is
in the
that
application.
important to the integrity of FISA applications?
Yes, sir.
In February of 2020, you assured the committee that you took these FISA abuses seriously, that you were working to address them. A year and a half later, the Office of the Inspector General reported that you weren't. They reported systemic noncompliance and essentially that some FBI field personnel took the Woods procedure as a joke. If we can't trust your past reforms, how seriously should we take your promises of future reform?
I appreciate the opportunity to address this one. So that OIG finding actually applies to, number one, that applies to compliance problems that occurred before all the fixes that I was testifying to you all about. Even though the report came out later, it was covering a time period that predated all of the fixes and reforms we put in place.
Your general counsel assured Mr. Durham that the abuses would not have happened because of the new procedures for supervisorial review, yet some of the worst abuses in Crossfire Hurricane were committed by supervisory agents. So why should we have any great confidence that's not going to happen again?
There are a couple different sets of reforms here. So the first is on the reforms that we put in place in response to the Inspector General's Crossfire Hurricane report.
But we can't trust your supervisors is the problem. The problem seems to be that this power exists at all, and human beings, being what they are, will tend to abuse them. Could you describe the term parallel construction as it relates to evidence produced in FISA searches?
Parallel construction? I'm not sure I've used that
Doesn't
term
that refer to
before.
the FBI using forbidden information from a 702 search to alert local law enforcement to search for and then produce the same material without revealing that it came from an improper search?
I'm just not sure about the use of the term.
Well, has the FBI ever employed that particular tactic in prosecuting American citizens?
Not to my knowledge, but again, I can look into that and get back to you.
What percentage of FISA warrant applications are rejected by the FISA court?
I don't know that we have that number. There's usually a back and forth with the court. It's not unusual for the court to...
It's a fraction of percentage, isn't it?
A fraction of a percentage?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if that's right, but it's definitely a small number. And I think that's partly because our folks learn over time what the court expects.
Which makes that sound an awful lot like a rubber stamp. I see my time's expired. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. Good afternoon, Director Wray. Thank you for coming.
I yield back.
Mr. Clyde?
Thank you, Chairman Rogers. Director Wray, as I'm sure you know, this week, the House has been considering the reauthorization of Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, commonly known as FISA. I've been deeply troubled with the abuse of Section 702 of FISA in recent years, and so your testimony today is very well timed. Thank you. So, Director Wray, does the FBI currently comply in every way with the current Section 702 of FISA?
My understanding is that we're in compliance with the law.
Okay, so you think you do. All right, how do you respond to an unsealed document released by the U.S. Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court on May 19th, 2023, which states your agency, the FBI, illegally misused this tool more than 278,000 times between 2020 and early 2021? And is this number of 278,000 abuses accurate?
So I appreciate the question. I'm glad to have the opportunity to clarify that. So first off, I would say that that opinion covers activity, querying activity that occurs all before all these reforms that we've put in place. So that's number one. Second,
When did you start putting those reforms in place?
Mid
after this?
mid 2022, somewhere in that range.
2022 or 2023?
They started in 2022 and they kind of rolled into 23. They obviously
Okay,
don't just
all
flick
right.
a switch.
All
But
right.
but the second thing I would say too is when you look at the FISA court, the same judges evaluating our compliance with 702 after all those reforms have put in place, you see consistently compliance rates well into the high 90% range, and the court actually commending the FBI for the improvements that they've seen because of the reform. So that's the second point.
Okay,
A third
so-
point I would make to you, third point, this is important because you asked, a third point that is important is that the querying that you're talking about in that opinion that again covers older activity, something like 99.7% of it would all have been prevented by the reforms that we've put in place.
Okay.
On top of that, the vast majority of those queries, the 278,000, are not actually 702 queries, much less non-compliant 702 queries.
Well, let me ask you this. This report ended in early 2021, and you started in mid-2022, so that would be an entire year. So during that time frame, how many times did the FBI abuse its FISA authority? Do you know?
I don't have any period of non-compliance that I can report here from that period, but I can
Okay.
tell you this.
Well,
The
all right,
court,
that-
the
thank-
court's
thank you for
opinion
answering
that
that
covers the
question.
more recent period.
As you know, the
Once-
government agencies typically need a warrant issued by a judge before they can access American citizens' phone calls, texts, internet searches, and emails. However, the government, in my opinion, has been able to query Section 702 acquired communications as an end run around the Fourth Amendment. My colleague Andy Biggs, representative from Arizona, has an amendment to the current FISA reauthorization that would require the government to obtain a warrant or to obtain a FISA court order prior to conducting a U.S. citizen query of information already collected through the 702 FISA program. You know, you previously stated in a Senate hearing in December that it would be unworkable to require the government to get a warrant before collecting Americans' private communications. Yet former NSA lawyer George Kroner recently estimated the warrant requirement would force the FBI to get about 3 warrants a day. Now, Director Wray, you've got more than 30,000 employees that work for the FBI. Are you seriously saying that 3 warrants a day is too much of a burden for the FBI to protect our Fourth Amendment rights?
That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is, number one, no court has found that the Fourth Amendment requires us to use a warrant to look at information, to query information that's already in our 702 holdings lawfully, and the only courts to look at it have gone the other way. That's one. Number two, the problem with the warrant requirement goes beyond any kind of burden or delay that comes with it. The big part of the problem is that it's often only by running the query that we get to see the information that tells us whether or not we would meet a warrant requirement in the first place.
All right,
Because
I've
these are
got one more
conducted at
question
the
for you
front
before my
end
time
of
runs
the
out.
Investigation.
All right. We have, looking at the breakdown of the FBI's $11.3 billion budget, like last year, almost 60% of the budget is categorized as defense spending and only 40% as non-defense spending. And to me, that seems odd. I read your mission priorities and I did not see any reference to DOD. I mean, the FBI is not part of the Department of Defense and they're a domestic law enforcement agency. So why is the FBI's budget categorized as 60% defense spending?
I believe the answer to your question, and I'm not an appropriations expert, but I believe the answer to your question is what's so-called NIP funding, which is overseen by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. So a significant chunk of our budget is considered defense spending because of its part of the intelligence community budget, if you will. So it gets a little more complicated than that, but I think that's the high-level answer to your question.
Okay, all right, my time has expired, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Director Wray, for being here. How many shots did the shooter fire?
Well, we know that he fired at least 8 because we recovered 8 cartridges on the roof.
Okay, and are all the cartridges and the unspent bullets, have they been, you know how many there are? You've accounted for all of those?
We,
So I assume, yeah.
we believe we have. Again, was lots of work still ongoing, but yes, we believe we have accounted.
And did the recovered shells, the cartridges, match the shooter's rifle?
My recollection is yes.
And you conducted analysis that confirms that?
Well, we work with ATF, but yes, so some of the work has been divided up. But
And how many shells casings were recovered from the location of the counter snipers?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear the last part.
From the counter snipers location?
That I don't have the answer, at least here at my fingertips.
Okay. Did the blood and tissue pattern of the shooter, did it match the stories or the witness testimony that you've heard so far?
Can you, I'm not sure I'm following the question.
Well, I assume you've interviewed the counter snipers, or you have that evidence, and other witnesses describing the kill of the shooter. And I'm wondering if the blood and tissue and brain matter is consistent with the testimony that you're receiving. In other words, is the physical...
In terms of the manner of death? and so
Exactly. Is the
forth? Yeah.
physical evidence consistent with where the shot from the counter sniper took place?
Yeah, so the autopsy is being handled by, as is not unusual, the state authorities. My understanding is, thus far, I don't think it's fully complete, which is not, again, not totally unusual. But so far, nothing remarkable on that front.
That's from the body itself, but from actually the scene where the shooter was found, is everything consistent with the testimony, the physical evidence at the scene? Is that consistent with the testimony you've seen, that you've heard so far?
So far, yes. Again, ongoing investigation.
Were you able to determine whether the shooter took the gun up with him when he climbed up to the top of the roof, or was it already placed there somewhere?
So that is something that we're drilling into right now that we don't know the answer to yet. I can tell you, which may be relevant, though, to your question, that, and I don't think this has been reported yet, that the weapon had a collapsible stock, which could explain why it might have been less easy for people to observe. You know, because one of the things that we're finding is people have observed him, the first people to observe him with the weapon were when he was already on the roof, and we haven't yet found anybody with firsthand observation of him with the weapon walking around beforehand. So that doesn't mean he wasn't, obviously, but the collapsible stock is potentially a very significant feature that might be relevant to that.
Did he have a scope?
I believe so, but as I sit here right now, I don't remember.
Okay. You mentioned about 2 hours before the incident that he'd had a drone and he was using a drone. Instead of me putting words in your mouth, just tell me how you discovered the drone, how you discovered the time, and how you discovered, if you can describe what he would have been observing with the drone and how you determined that, please.
So this is something that's very much ongoing right now. We're going back and forth with our lab as they continue to do work on it. What I would say is the drone was in his car. As I said, we've been able to, by exploiting the drone, determine its use and flight paths. There were no pictures or videos on the drone of the day of the rally, for example, but we have been able to reverse engineer the flight path of the drone from the day of the rally, and that's how we know that for about 11 minutes, from I think it's around 3:50 p.m. to 4 p.m., somewhere in that range, he was flying the drone, and we have the flight path. It's about 200 yards away from where former President Trump would ultimately be speaking. And so that would have primarily given him a vantage point. I'm trying to think how to describe this. If the former president's podium is that way,
Yeah.
the drone would be over here looking, say 200 yards again off this way, looking back. So it would have shown the shooter, we think, again, we're still doing more work on this. I really want to qualify what I'm saying, but I'm trying to be transparent and lean in here. We think it would have shown him kind of what would have been behind him.
But when you say behind him, behind the shooter?
Correct. Like, in other words, almost like giving him a rear view mirror of the scene behind him, except, again, he wasn't flying it overhead while he was later back for the assassination.
But he would have had, with the drone, he would have been able to also assess kind of, because the stage, I assume, was already set, he'd been able to assess that angle with the rooftop as well, forward and backward, I assume.
Well, certainly going towards the podium. Again, we're still trying to figure out exactly what he saw, because we're having to, in effect, because there's no recording of what he saw during those 11 minutes, you know, our hypothesis at this point, the experts think he would have been live streaming it. And so we're trying to, in effect, say, okay, if this was the flight pattern, given these capabilities of the drone, what would you have seen? What could you have seen for those 11 minutes? And again, it wasn't over the stage or the kind of the hub of the rally. It was about 200 yards away, but it looks like it would have been looking, let's say, you know, length of a football field or so, more, you know, kind of towards the podium.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
How many?
Provide.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I yield back.
Ms. Stefanik.
Director Wray, have you read Robert Hur's special counsel report? I have reviewed it. Do you believe Joe Biden mishandled classified information? I'm not going to discuss the report. That's the special counsel's report, and I've referred to it. In your opinion as director of the FBI, do you believe he mishandled classified information?
Again, I'm just going to refer to the report, and the special counsel can speak for himself on his report.
Are you aware, and this is breaking news right now, are you aware that there's an audio recording of Joe Biden saying to his ghostwriter in February of 2016, quote, "I just found all the classified stuff downstairs," end quote? Are you aware of that audio recording?
Again, I would just respectfully refer you to the special counsel.
No, I'm asking you,
himself.
are you aware as director of the FBI? You're either aware or you're not.
I'm aware. Am I aware of what now?
Whether the audio exists of Joe Biden saying in February 2017, quote, "I just found all the classified stuff downstairs," end quote, to his ghostwriter.
Again, I'm just going to refer to the special counsel and his testimony and his report.
It sounds like you might be aware of it then. In front of this very committee in an open session, your predecessor, Jim Comey, testified that he did not follow the proper protocol regarding the notification of Congress of the opening of the Crossfire Hurricane. That would be the counterintelligence investigation into President Trump in 2016. To address this illegal abuse of power by the FBI, this committee included direction to the FBI in the IAA requiring notification to congressional leadership of any counter-intel investigation into a federal candidate for office. Is there any counterintelligence investigation into either Joe Biden or Donald Trump?
I would just say I'll refer you to the special counsel has.
It's not a question about the special
investigation.
counsel.
Right.
That's a requirement in the IAA of the FBI. Is there a counterintelligence investigation into either Joe Biden or Donald Trump?
There's no investigation that I could confirm here, no.
Is there a counterintelligence investigation?
Again, I'm not confirming any investigation into either candidate.
Are you aware that you're required by the IAA to notify Congress of any counterintelligence investigation?
And we will comply with the law.
Have you already complied with the law? Has there been a notification?
I believe we have been in compliance with the law.
You believe you have been, or has there been a notification to Congress of any counterintelligence investigation of a federal candidate?
I believe we have complied with the law.
Has there been a counter-intel assessment conducted on either President Biden or President Trump?
Again, there's no assessment that I would confirm here in any way. I believe we have been in compliance with the law.
How about on an immediate family member, and by that I mean spouses or children, of either President Biden or President Trump?
Again, I'm not in the business of confirming, especially not in open hearings, assessments or anything like that when it comes to counterintelligence matters.
So you will confirm in the classified setting when we ask you this question of whether there's a counterintelligence investigation, because you are aware that according to the IAA, you are required by law to notify Congress of any counterintelligence investigation, not just for presidential candidates, but any federal candidate.
We will comply with the law.
So you will answer this in the classified hearing later today?
We will comply with the law.
And what's your understanding of the law?
There's a whole series of oversight requirements that we have related to counterintelligence matters. I'm not going to try to go through all of them.
But specifically the
here.
notification of Congress of a counterintel investigation onto a federal candidate. What is your understanding of the law?
Again, I would want to refer to the lawyers to make sure that I'm appropriately complying with it, but I can tell you we're going to comply with the law, and my understanding is we have been.
Is your assessment that you're required to notify Congress of any counterintel investigation into any federal candidate?
I'm going to defer to the lawyers as to the precision of that.
You're the director of the FBI. They report to you. What is your understanding of the requirement in the IAA?
We're going to comply with the law, including whatever's in the IAA.
I want to turn to the search warrants and the search. In one case of Mar-a-Lago, an unprecedented raid and a search working with Joe Biden's legal team. Were you or your staff, did you have any communication about either the execution of the search warrant on Mar-a-Lago or the search of documents working with Joe Biden's lawyer? Was there any communication with Joe Biden, of you or your team?
Not to my knowledge.
With any White House staff?
By me or my team?
By you or any personnel at the FBI?
Again, I want to make sure I've got your question right. By me or my staff, with who about which?
With the White House staff about the execution of a search warrant on Mar-a-Lago or the search working with Joe Biden's lawyers of classified information?
Not to my knowledge.
What about the Attorney General?
I can't speak for the Attorney General.
No, was there any communication with your staff, with the Attorney General, or you, regarding the execution of the search warrant or the search of Joe Biden's classified documents?
Well, any search would be done in coordination with the Department of Justice. As to who may have communicated with whom.
I'm asking
between
if
the
you-
FBI and the department, I can't.
I'm asking if you communicated
Whether I communicated?
with the Attorney General prior or after the execution of the search warrant on Mar-a-Lago.
No.
Do you think it is a national...
Hold on, prior or after?
Prior or after?
Well, I would have had conversations with the Attorney General about the appointment of, at that time, Mr. Lausch,
And what were those conversations?
just about the fact that he was going to be named. But that's not really about the search itself, I suppose.
And my last question is, do you think it is a national security threat to have a federal campaign account on TikTok?
Well, I've been very clear about my views about TikTok and the national security concerns it presents, and we ban TikTok on all FBI devices. As to what campaigns choose to do with their platforms, I'll leave that to them.
So you don't think it's a national security threat?
I'm not weighing in on that, no.
As the director of the FBI, I agree with you that TikTok is a national security threat. I think it's a national security threat to have campaign accounts on TikTok. You cannot say here today that you think that's a national security threat?
I think TikTok represents all sorts of national security threats. As to whether specific account holders choose to exercise their right to access a TikTok account, I'll leave that to them.
Well, we have a disagreement. I think it's a national security threat to have a presidential campaign on TikTok. Yield back.
Mr. Krishnamurthy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Wray, could you assure the American public today that no nonviolent protester about a ceasefire of the Middle East will be investigated or surveilled by the FBI?
We are not going to be investigating nonviolent First Amendment activity.
And could you just assure, whatever their position is on the Middle East or the 2024 election, if there is an American who's out there engaged in expressing their view, whether that is for a ceasefire or whatever that is, the FBI is not going to be investigating them or surveilling them, correct?
Our mission is to protect the American people and uphold the Constitution, and we intend to do both. We embrace both parts of that mission. In our view, it doesn't matter what you're ticked off about or who you're ticked off at. There's a right way under the First Amendment to exercise those views, and we're going to help protect that. And there's a wrong way to exercise those views, and that's violence and threats, and we are going to investigate that.
I appreciate your saying that because I think I share your view that the First Amendment and peaceful protest is at the heart of our democracy. I also have appreciated some of your views on making sure that as we appropriately investigate Chinese threats to infrastructure and the Chinese Communist Party's threats and deal with the cybersecurity, you've been very clear that you do not think that that should involve the profiling of Chinese Americans, and I think you've been sensitive in some remarks you made at University of Michigan about how in the past that has happened. Can you speak to some of the past history of profiling of Asian Americans and how under your leadership you're going to make sure that that doesn't happen as we appropriately investigate Chinese Communist Party threats to the United States?
We are going to aggressively pursue the threat posed by the CCP
with investigations that are predicated on the facts and the law and our policies. And they're not going to be based on race, ethnicity, or national origin, and they haven't been. Now, it is the case that the Chinese government aggressively targets individuals here to enlist them in their efforts, but they also aggressively suppress and coerce and harass Chinese Americans and Chinese visitors here. And so we view as part of our role to help protect those people. And so part of the key is drawing the distinction in between the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party, the malicious actor, and Chinese Americans, Chinese dissidents, the victims.
And as you do this, Director Wray, like I said, I think under your leadership from your public comments, you've been quite good about drawing that distinction. But do you bring to it a historical awareness that Asian Americans in this country have been profiled in our history, just like I'm sure you have a historical awareness of the FBI's role during the civil rights movement?
Certainly, there have been abuses or mistakes in the past, and we're determined to make sure that those things don't happen again. But I do want to make clear that our work, at least since I've been director, focused on Chinese aggression, is based on the facts and the law and proper predication.
And you can assure sort of Chinese Americans that they aren't being profiled or targeted in any way based on their ethnicity or race?
We are not going to open investigations based on profiling people for race, ethnicity, or national origin or anything of that sort.
Thank you. I'm done with my question.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Last week, Director Wray, Chairman Gallagher, Mike Gallagher, and I introduced a bill to address TikTok, which you have spoken about before. And actually, in last year's Worldwide Threat Assessment hearing in March of last year, you said, quote, TikTok is a tool that ultimately is within the control of the Chinese government, and it, to me, screams out with national security concerns, correct?
Correct.
So Mike Gallagher and I introduced this bill, which requires the divestment of TikTok from ByteDance. ByteDance, as you know, is the parent company of TikTok and is controlled ultimately by the Chinese government. Now, interestingly, after we introduced this bill, it got marked up in the House Energy and Commerce Committee. And interestingly, on the morning of that markup, a certain pop-up message and push notification went out to thousands and thousands of users across the country, and it looked like this. Essentially, it said, quote, stop a TikTok shutdown. Congress is planning a total ban of TikTok. Now, of course, setting aside the misinformation of this message, we are not calling for a ban of TikTok, but a divestment. What was very interesting to us is that the app actually used the geolocation targeting data associated with minor children to push this notification to them, to cause them to then call many congressional offices with thousands and thousands of phone calls. Now, when they called these offices, they asked the questions such as the following. What is Congress? What is a congressman? Let me have my TikTok back. And on top of that, in one case, one member of the Energy and Commerce Committee had someone call in impersonating his son, asking to speak with his dad and ask him to allow TikTok to come back. So, Mr. Wray, you've also talked about various threats associated with TikTok, including its ability to potentially mobilize public opinion. This particular push notification pop-up ended up convincing many members of the House Energy and Commerce Committee that day to change from being lean yeses to being hard yeses, because they felt this was exactly the nature of the threat that the legislation was being proposed to address. So could you just talk about whether this is an example of the type of mobilization of public opinion that TikTok, under the control of the Chinese Communist Party, might conduct in the future?
Well, while I can't speak to the specific example, I can tell you that the kind of thing you're describing illustrates why this is such a concern. I think Americans need to understand that distinctions that we take for granted in our system between businesses and government, between the businesses and the government itself, don't exist
for all practical purposes in China. So Americans need to ask themselves whether they want to give the Chinese government the ability to control access to their data, whether they want to give the Chinese government the ability to control the information they get through the recommendation algorithm, and whether they want to give the Chinese government the ability to leverage the data, the software on their devices, which allows the Chinese government to compromise their devices if they so choose to exercise.
And just let the record reflect that when you were talking about the type of algorithm or example of what could happen, you were pointing to this very poster with the pop-up menu. Let me just make it clear. You cannot rule out that the Chinese Communist Party actually ordered this particular pop-up to appear on people's phones that day, right?
That's right, and I think it illustrates why when it comes to the algorithm and the recommendation algorithm and the ability to conduct influence operations, that is extraordinarily difficult to detect. And that's what makes it such a pernicious risk.
And that's the problem. You can't tell. Because the CCP ultimately controls ByteDance, ByteDance can manipulate the algorithm and has access to all this data. Now, Director Haynes, in this year's threat assessment on page 12, you said TikTok accounts run by a PRC propaganda arm reportedly targeted candidates from both political parties during the US midterms in 2022, right? Can you just speak up?
Sorry, yes, I was just getting to the page, apologies.
So just to be clear,
Yeah.
TikTok has already been used to influence the elections in 2022. And then on that same page, it says TikTok could, quote, attempt to influence elections in 2024. So, Director Haynes, you cannot rule out that the CCP could, again, just like they did here, use TikTok as a platform to influence 2024 elections, right?
We cannot rule out that the CCP could use it, correct?
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here, Director Wray. Director Wray, the FBI is the independent law enforcement agency under the Department of Justice. Is that correct?
Yes.
And does the FBI director currently report to anyone?
Well, you mean in a chain of command reporting structure kind of thing? Yeah, so the FBI is part of the Justice Department. On the org chart, you would see that the FBI director, and this has been true for decades, reports to the Deputy Attorney General, who reports to the Attorney General. Obviously, reports in a communication sense, I report to any number of people.
As opposed to a micromanagement reporting system.
Correct.
And you would take issue, would you not, with any proposal that would change or alter that chain of command and place you or place a FBI director in the position of reporting directly to the president? Would you not? You would oppose that?
I don't think that would be a wise reporting structure. I think the structure that we've had for decades now makes sense. I think there's a difference between independence in a sort of organizational structure perspective and independence in terms of the way you do the work. Obviously, the FBI is part of the Justice Department.
Well, reporting directly to the president would eliminate your independence, would it not?
I don't think it would help.
Yeah. And you're familiar with Project 2025, are you not?
I mean, I've seen news reports about it. I'm not particularly familiar with it.
You're aware that it is a game plan for President Trump's first 120 days in office, correct?
I'm really not familiar with the details. Again, I've seen reporting about it.
It is, and what he proposes to do is to force the FBI director to appoint, report directly to him. That's what he wants to do within the first 120 days. He also wants to eliminate the position of FBI General Counsel. That is also set forth in Project 2025. How would you recommend that?
I think the FBI's Office of General Counsel serves an incredibly important role, including in terms of advising our workforce. We have 38,000 people. The idea of having an organization like ours, an independent law enforcement agency like ours that doesn't have its own general counsel's office doesn't make sense to me.
Well, it would seem like any proposal that would force the director to report to the president, and then there would be no legal counsel for the director of the FBI. That seems like it's an attempt to neuter the FBI and render it accountable only to the president. Isn't that correct?
Well, let me put it this way. I recognize that the FBI director, this FBI director and every FBI director before me, serves at the pleasure of the president. And that's part of our system. I was appointed by President Trump. I respect that. I think that's a part of our structure. But independence in terms of how we do our work is what matters to me. And we need to be able to do our work in a way that is free from political interference.
Well, you wouldn't be able to do that by reporting everything you do to the president and getting his authority and approval before you take action, correct?
I don't think that would be a wise approach.
And then there's even a proposal to replace many of those 38,000 dedicated civil servants who work for the FBI, replace them with a MAGA group that has pledged its allegiance to Donald Trump. What danger would that bring to the FBI if that were to happen?
Well, again, I haven't read or reviewed this thing that you're
assuming
referring to.
what I say is
but,
true.
But
What
the FBI is
impact would
made
that
up of
have?
the FBI is made up of 38,000 dedicated career law enforcement professionals. It has no political appointees of any kind, unless you count me as a
You don't
nominee
want
of the
that to
former
change
president.
either, do
I
you?
don't think that should change.
You
I
don't
think
want
that is
a bunch
that is
of MAGA
part of how we do
loyalists
our work.
being,
Right.
being the employees of the FBI.
We're coming up on 116
it would-
years of the FBI, and that's the way it has been for
It
116
would
years.
be
for a reason.
crazy to take 38,000 MAGA loyalists and put them at the FBI. That's frightening. That's what Project 2025 proposes, and I'm glad to know that you are not with that program, and with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Florida, Director.